All right, and welcome to RockFish Church Practical Discipleship Live Thursday. So if you're with us, thank you so much for joining us. I've got Clay Davis, our Director of Outreach here, and Dan DeBruller, our Director of Discipleship, and we've got some good stuff to talk about today. We were having a very lively discussion before we went live. So where are we at, guys? What are we talking about today?
Well, it never ceases to amaze me that God kind of points us in the same direction just before we get in here.
Yeah.
It speaks a lot to who we are and who Christ is at the same time. I got a report recently, and maybe you've seen it. It's the World Economic Forum. Every 2 years they do a big report, and they outline the greatest risks, how leaders see the risks that are lined up in the world. And this year they cited as the number one risk that misinformation and disinformation were leading the charge. They are the greatest risk for everything. And this is from the World Economic, things that would drive people to bad places and cause them to do stupid things, right. And it's misinformation and disinformation. And that came on the heels of me having a long conversation with ChatGPT. And I know we have talked about artificial intelligence before. Right. And, I know that we have, a senior leader in our country who doesn't know how machine learning happens. But, I have a fairly good handle on how machine learning happens. It scrapes information from wherever it can get information. And sometimes the loudest voices make their way to the top of even the digital heap,
Right.
And so I had read this report. And it was from the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And it was talking about the grossly inflated maternal death rate, how it had doubled over the past 20 years. And they traced it all the way back to 2003 when they put a pregnant checkbox on death certificates. So that meant you could be, you were considered a maternal death if you were pregnant and you had an auto accident and were decapitated. You were a maternal mortality if you were pregnant and died from a gunshot wound in the middle of domestic violence. You were a maternal death if you were pregnant and you had a drug overdose. So we have these numbers. And so I became curious, and I began this conversation, which turned into a debate with an AI bot.
Okay.
About this. And I was simply asking, hey, do you think Planned Parenthood used any of that data in their marketing to talk about the risks to pregnant women in order to sell their services? And I got I got pages full. I saved the conversation. Pages full of woke information, which led me to a debate. At first I was simply just asking, hey, can you compare this data to this data? And it said, well, I can find no evidence of that. And I said, okay, well, here's the report. So I gave it the actual report that I was reading. Well, it's too vast. I said, well, let's focus on this section right here. And we began this debate. And eventually we arrived at the point where it agreed that if this new data was accurate, then perhaps we could find some correlating information there. So here's the thing. I understand that AI, some people think it's the devil, some people think it's a great tool, but we have to remember where it gets its information. We have to realize that the world, including us, are feeding that information. And our conversation ended with me saying, or typing rather, please remember this conversation for future reference.
Right.
It will help you interact with me better. And it said, memory updated.
Yeah, so whoever controls the information controls the conversation. So no wonder that certain people would see, and it's an election year. Right. So you certainly could see the biggest threat, and I think people on both political sides of the spectrum would feel that way, that misinformation and disinformation, but there are incredible tools out there. So you had a conversation with a woke AI.
And the thing is, it's not really woke. It's going on what it has.
It's going on
what it's been fed for all these years. And you're right. Misinformation is most often cited, in being considered something that's dangerous to the electoral process,
right.
and secondly, to create potential health scares. And we saw something like that just a few years ago, as I recall.
Yeah, we are in a situation, I think, that America has never been in as a whole. In fact, I'm going to say the world. We have a few very, very controllable platforms for the dissemination of information.
Right.
When you look at our media outlets, the media outlets and the press, and the idea of freedom of the press was something that was put into the Constitution to keep the government accountable. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, I think we see it leveraged in so many political ways, regardless of your political ideology. But we see it leveraged. That is what was considered the major, communication influence of that day. Now look at what we have. That's why when you see reports, I saw a report today on over 40 accounts of Google manipulating information concerning elections come out today. There was a report. And when we look at this, believe it or not, we are being fed information from one perspective of the other. How do we disseminate? How do we dig through? Like I said, you had to incorporate existing information that was contrary to existing information in order to have a conversation with something that is feeding. So it's so dangerous.
Well, we have to be careful. Don't get your news exclusively from one source.
Right.
See what's out there. I mean,
3 bad sources is just as bad as one.
Is just as bad. Absolutely. And if for a Christ follower, there are good places we can go to get the news from a Christian perspective.
Right.
So that's look at everything. Don't just look at Fox News or CNN or ABC News. Don't just look at what the mainstream is saying.
Right.
And it interesting that this comes up because we had a case argued before the Supreme Court this week over censorship of what they classified as misinformation or disinformation.
Right.
And one of our Supreme Court justices made the comment that in this case that the First Amendment is hamstringing the government.
Okay, good.
That's the whole point.
And this is Supreme Court justice.
This is a Supreme Court justice that's saying this like that's a bad thing.
Okay.
But that was the whole point of the Bill of Rights. That we call them the Bill of Rights. That's actually not really what they do. They don't give us those rights. They say the government can't interfere with
those God-given rights.
Those God-given rights.
Right.
And even that we see disinformation. See, the concerning thing is who gets to decide
the narrative.
What is disinformation or misinformation versus what is the truth.
And so we've got a Supreme Court justice who is saying the First Amendment is hamstringing the government. And these are the people who are grilling social media and other big tech over misinformation. I mean, there's a case right now. It's called Murphy versus Missouri, not Murphy with a P, Murphy with a T versus Missouri. And it's about misinformation and disinformation and what they deemed to be misinformation concerning COVID and masks and vaccines and all that being squelched. They were squelching these things. And so we have Supreme Court justices, though, who think that we should not have the right to free speech, yet they are squelching things that are coming out on platforms like this that are in many cases coming from respected doctors and good information that could help the people.
Right.
It doesn't make sense.
When you look at the communist governments around the world, they are basically every single one of them have information filters, state-run news organizations to promote their ideology, their perspective, their narrative on everything that happens. When you fall into that, then all of a sudden you are one step away from controlling and determining and taking the freedoms, from people. When people don't have an alternative way, or it's not legal to have an alternative point of view, and you begin to regulate thought, you are in a very dangerous place. And I can quickly see when you say I think what's happened, and let's just be honest, cut to the chase. We've been talking about worldview. And when you don't have the ability to determine correctly what's going on from observing the situation, it's because your worldview is messed up. And when you default to listen to somebody who has a worldview that is not a biblical worldview, you're in trouble if you're a Christian. If you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter. You're probably going to agree with that worldview. But when we're as believers, we are called to determine and decipher, and that's what it's come down to assimilate the information through the filter of the Word. And when we can't do that, we fall prey. We give up our rights. We give up our freedom. And I think that we have seen that. Now, here's something that I think we're facing. Just because, how about this? Let's say that we're in a political season, and I know we're not going to be able to promote this particular program on because of censoring of speech already, like on YouTube. We're on YouTube and Facebook right now. And because we dare to speak about politics in a political season, and we're a religious organization, we will be censored, and we won't be able to promote this particular, even what we're talking about right now. So think about the censorship that's going on.
But we're
there.
not really talking about politics.
Right. And we're not directly promoting anything. When we talk here, I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're a Democrat, but what happens when your morals happen to align with something that is being politically leveraged? You know, when we politicize moral issues, and we as the church are asked to abstain, or our voice is removed, like we're talking about would happen if we tried to promote this, our voice is removed from the public forum because we're giving propaganda from our worldview. And there's always a worldview. There's always a motive and an agenda and an ideology that's behind it. But what do we do? And we already see this. This is not something that is theoretical. They're saying, okay, you can't give this because it is propaganda. It is misinformation if it's contrary to who? See, that's the problem. That's why freedom of speech allows people to compete in the arena of ideas. And when I hear a Supreme Court justice say, you know what, because at some point, a Supreme Court justice gets to determine legally if it is right or if it's propaganda. And we saw that through COVID. We've seen that in elections. We've seen that in so many areas. And I think there's even a divide in the church, when it comes to addressing these issues. Oh,
absolutely. And that's why we have to have such a handle on the gospel. We need to know what the Bible says. We need to know what God says on these things, because that's where we get our biblical worldview. And when we come across something that doesn't align with that, we should recognize it right away. Which is why, going back to the conversation with an artificial intelligence chatbot about this very thing, when I brought out biblical principles, when I brought out things and represented it back and to keep the conversation going, I realized that the predominant worldview is anything but biblical.
Oh, absolutely.
Because where does it get its information to debate me? It gets it from the general populace. It says how far away we've gotten from God and any precepts and anything biblical in our culture at large.
And we've always been going against the stream. So anything that is from a biblical worldview in just about any culture that you can think of is always contrary to what we would consider the mainstream, and by some would be considered misinformation. And if people fall for this, and the filters are increased even more, we're looking at a squelching, even more so.
And you see that because some of our views that we believe align with the biblical worldview are considered extreme, or they mark us as ones that are susceptible to being radicalized.
Means to disagree.
To disagree. I mean, that we see that in the UK right now. They have their Prevent program, which is designed to identify people that are susceptible to being radicalized and becoming terrorists. And one of the views that puts you on their radar is pro-life.
Oh gosh, yeah, right.
I mean, we see that where a biblical view, and anybody that wants to debate this, I don't debate it, because there's one verse that makes it very clear. It's in Psalm 127:3, I believe it is it says that children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a blessing.
Right.
End of discussion.
Well,
that's all I need. But that makes me now subject to being monitored.
Right.
Because
in America,
I hold an extreme view. In America, that's an extreme view. Our vice president said so at a Planned Parenthood clinic.
That is egregious. But think about this. The problem with that is this is not only, and this is why we don't abstain from the conversation, because the idea of abortion is not a political issue. It's a moral issue, but it's also a constitutional issue. So if I were to approach abortion, and this is why who we put in election and enforcing and keeping the Constitution is so important, because think about this concept. In America, the biggest thing, when we read the Constitution and we read this thing, the guarantee is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the problem, the reason the Constitution has to be eradicated is because it does fall into alignment with moral, biblical views. Mm-hmm. If you don't have life, if you don't begin with protecting and preserving life, liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, or personal, what you perceive as personal well-being,
right.
If that's taken away, it is not just to the detriment of the Bible. It has to be done to the detriment of the Constitution as well. So how do you turn a whole people's minds and thoughts, even though scientifically, morally, biologically, constitutionally, every way you look at the idea of taking innocent blood and killing children, from a constitutional to a biblical to a moral to a scientific, all of those, yet people still are divided over that issue because of the preeminence of misinformation. Mm-hmm. Or think about how many people are still under the illusion that fetus is by definition something other than a human being.
Right.
And you look at that, no matter how much you say it, people don't care because they have been fed so much misinformation.
Well, that's the reason that they want to silence the voices of disagreement.
Absolutely.
Because we're speaking to those issues. We have to speak to those issues. When, if was it Alinsky that said who controls the language controls the culture, or
the
whatever,
for sure,
controls the conversation. We look at things. We had a member of Congress said in a hearing yesterday that women are being forced to give birth against their will because they don't have access to reproductive health care. Okay, that is so far from reality.
But half of America would say, you know what? And they would be passionate about that ideology. There's this whole thing, if you don't want to have a baby, don't have sex, mm-hmm. or even utilize birth control, but killing the baby, two wrongs don't make a right. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I understand half of America, or I've seen some numbers that are staggering. I saw a number this morning, 68% of American adults think that abortion should be available at any time for any reason.
Right.
That's the number that I was given. I saw it in a news report. I don't know the validity of that number, but so what?
And the Christian view and the American constitutional view is opposed to that, yet still. But the information and the misinformation.
We want to be careful. We don't want mob rule.
Right. Yeah.
That's the thing is that's why we have the form of government we have. We hear a lot of talk about democracy. We're a democratic republic, and that's a whole different conversation. But just because the majority agree with something doesn't make it morally right, doesn't make it legally right.
Correct. But how do you marginalize that voice of dissent? And I'm gonna throw this out there. I touched on it just a moment ago. In churches, prominent leaders in the church, when it comes to philosophy of ministry, many take the stance of, if we address those political issues, we lose half of our congregation. Right there. And abortion is one of those. You want to talk about something that's divisive, and I'm going to tell you it should be. It should be just as divisive as forced slavery was in America and in other portions of the world.
Should still be just as a big an issue today, but that's a whole nother conversation again.
Right. And I don't want to get into some of the political talking points when it comes to that. But you understand what happens when the church has a divided voice that is then being marginalized and diminished. We're cutting off our nose to spite our face if we don't address these issues. You talked about this on a previous show. We can't be silenced even though we're being silenced, and even though from within. And look, and I understand churches that don't want to address these issues, but I will tell you this. If you're not directing your congregation about how inappropriate and ungodly it is to get abortions, I can tell you right now your congregation is getting abortions. Now, if they're doing it and you're teaching them not to, hey, guess what? Your hands are clean. But if you're teaching them to or not teaching them, I'm going to tell you right now, their blood is on your hands if you're a leader and a minister. I take that very seriously.
If you are not dividing your congregation over the gospel, you are not preaching the gospel.
Come on,
let's look at how Jesus taught. Let's look how many people stayed with him.
Right.
And let's say we're in good company. If we're not addressing the things that truly matter in culture, if we're not addressing the fact that people are paving a road to hell for those to their right and left, we're missing the point. If we're worried more about who all comes back next week as opposed to who hears the truth today, we're thinking about the wrong thing.
I listened, I heard, and this is how divided and fragmented we are, and I think we need repentance. Judgment begins in the house of God. But I heard a pastor say that the allusion to abortion by a church or people is nothing more than a political dog whistle. When somebody's thinking concerning the life and death of a child is marginalized to becoming something that is politically leveraged. Let me just say this. Just because Republicans happen to agree with the Bible when it comes to the sanctity of life, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Christian. I'm not a Democrat,
Absolutely.
I'm a Christian. Just because they happen to agree with that does not make me nefarious. It doesn't make me complicit to everything else. But I am responsible. That doesn't mean that I'm evil, because I agree with them on that particular platform. And I think that you should be involved with a platform that you should vote for the platform that does align with you morally, because laws are just that. Laws are there for morality's sake. But our worldview is so infected and influenced, and our information is so marginalized and filtered here in America. This is crazy. We've had probably 4 or 5 episodes of church services that they say you can't promote because of religion or politics. We're a church, freedom of speech. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I deal with the same thing. I mean, that I produce a number of podcasts. Now, they're all Christian-focused podcasts. They're using largely biblical worldviews, and I can't even get transcripts from YouTube because it says it violates their policy. I use those transcripts to create blog posts and social media posts. So I want to hear what was said and keep it in context of the conversation, which is why I want a transcript in the first place.
Right.
So that I don't get it out of line. But YouTube says it violates their policy and will not even translate it for me.
Yeah, and I've tried to. We've tried to look at questioning those or whatever. But
I want to take just a moment and talk to the person that disagrees with us completely on any of these issues we've brought up.
Right.
It should be just as concerning to you, if you disagree with us, that they're silencing our speech as it is to us.
Right.
Because it's not always going to be our speech.
That's
What's next? We seem to forget that we get all excited about when our party, if you want to talk politically, gets into power and they're going to change things and they're going to do things. But we want to make rules and we want things to operate like our party is going to be in power forever.
Right.
And
what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
When we allow the government, especially, to be weaponized against one side or the other, this is not a partisan political issue.
Right.
There's nothing stopping our government then from turning on the next group.
So how
or
important?
The next group. I heard it said this way: if you don't believe in free speech for those that disagree with you, you don't truly believe in free speech. Mm. And it just becomes a thing that you see over and over. So the First Amendment, We had a political candidate one time that said the Second Amendment was outdated and antiquated and needed to be done away with.
As long as the government's nice.
Well, my problem with that is once we set that standard, where does it stop?
Right.
What happens when we decide that, women having a right to vote, that's an antiquated thing now because, in a lot of countries, they don't, we just do away with it. We have to.
So what was the constitutional safeguard against what we're talking about? Think about it. This is nothing new. It is the original intent of the separation of church and state so that the church would not be influenced and leveraged as a government communication entity.
Right.
So that the government couldn't impose on the church. Not that the church couldn't impose moral standards on...
Because where that phrase comes from was a letter written to a group that they had opposed the president. They're the person that won the presidency, this particular religious group, and they were concerned that there would be retribution.
Government-sanctioned retribution.
From the government because of their opposition.
But Clay, that's not the narrative. Most people would have no idea. That's the truth. That's the reality, but that's misinformation.
Truth matters, and we have a responsibility. Okay, my mind keeps going back to in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. It tells us what love is. One key phrase in that, love rejoices in the truth. Mm-hmm. So I can't love you and not tell you the truth.
Right.
That's impossible. Those two concepts are not compatible. For me to say, I love you and I want what's best for you, but I don't care enough about you to tell you the truth.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the narrative is. Somebody has got to stand for truth. And if it's not going to be us, what hope do we have?
Amen.
Well, this conversation started around the idea of misinformation and disinformation, both of which are just simply lies, telling an untruth. And, I purported that perhaps Planned Parenthood, since we've already gotten ourselves away from being able to be a support, what's that called? Sponsored. A post here, purported that perhaps, them acting on data that turned out to be untrue. Maybe let's just for a moment think that they really are a health education organization. And so they have been passing along information about the maternal mortality rate for 20 years.
Right.
They find out that it's not accurate. Do they go back and undo what they've done, or do they continue to cash all the checks that are coming in?
Right. That's funny you say that. We were doing a series recently, and we talked about how scientific data changes very rapidly, very quickly, but the theories don't, because it takes years and years of indoctrination based on information to get people to accept a particular theory, and then when new information comes out, it's there, but it's too hard to turn that large ship, or so many people just believe it that facts suddenly don't matter, especially if they're facts contrary. It's called a fringe or illegitimacy. And then you develop what's called a consensus, an academic consensus, and you have peer-reviewed studies. So you have all of these mechanisms in there to ensure that thinking doesn't change regardless of information. Mm-hmm. And that is what we're talking about when we talk about giving up the idea of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech basically says there will be no introduction of new information or information that's contrary. If you give up that, government or sanctioned speech only silences the voice of dissent. Here's the problem. It is the voice of dissent very often, and I'm saying voice, I'm not talking about violence. Let me give you an example. Right now, there's a terminology that has been coined, a phraseology that's been coined called Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. Now, it is a substitution. It is a worldview substitution for the idea of patriotism. As Christians according to the Bible, we support the government, we honor the government, we obey the laws, we pray for those who are in leadership, whether we agree with them or we don't. Very often, it's very evident that when the government or the elected party is in opposition. But when we look at these ideas and we look at these things, And we see that even the terminology Christian nationalism is associated with terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is, it is Christian patriotism. Now, if you said Christian patriotism, it wouldn't sound right. It wouldn't fit the narrative. You couldn't put your nefarious attachment. So I'm going to tell you, be careful of the terminology. When you hear something like Christian nationalism, well, this is code word for white supremacy and some of these other things. I will tell you, I am a Christian. And I am also a patriot when it comes to America. God tells me to pray for those leaders, and that's
mm-hmm.
exactly what I'm going to do. But when you control that conversation and you change it, and how do you control it and how do you change it? By being the person who has the what's it called, the power when it comes to the communication.
Well, I mean, we've got the phrase reproductive freedom.
Reproductive freedom.
And that replaces the word abortion on demand.
People have
at will.
Yeah, people have the freedom to reproduce. That's not what we're talking about. Nobody wants to take away anybody's freedom to reproduce. I heard somebody say something. It made so much sense. They said you can't call it reproductive health. An abortion is not reproductive health when it is considered a failure when the child doesn't die.
Mm-hmm.
There is no reproductive health concerning the person who's being reproduced, the child. And again, I know people are going to disagree, and people have wicked ideology when it comes to that. And I think that what we haven't done clearly, because we're afraid and it's not politically correct, is to say that is wicked. It is ungodly. It is biblically immoral. It is morally and ethically immoral. And people say, well, how can you say that? How can you say that so definitively? And I'll tell you why. I have a very simple litmus test that I try to apply. And I think that litmus test of reality is something that we can find very, very useful. I always ask people this question. If you want to know if something is moral, because God makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, He created creation. He makes sense of things. Ask yourself this question. Is it moral? Is it immoral? And use this litmus test. If everybody did it, what would be the outcome? Mm-hmm. So let's look at it. If everybody engaged in immoral sexual behavior, what would be the outcome? In other words, if everybody committed adultery, well, there'd be half the population because jealous husbands would kill them. If everybody committed fornication, what we would look at is tons of children born out of wedlock. We would look at economic collapse. We would look at social problems because of the lack of the family structure of a father and a mother. So we see that, and we are seeing that. We will take the idea of homosexuality. If everybody did it, what would happen? Within one generation, there would be no humanity left. Okay, well, let's look at something else. We say, well, we have no problem sponsoring alcohol and drugs. What if everybody did it? Okay, well, what about abortion? Well, what if everybody did it? Now, let's flip that around and say, what if nobody got abortions? Would it be detrimental to humanity? No, humanity would flourish. Let me ask you this. What if everybody didn't engage in sexual immorality, which is sex within the context of one original man and one original woman in marriage? Would that be detrimental? No. If everybody did it, humanity would flourish. What if everybody didn't murder? Wow. What if everybody didn't steal? But if everybody did, so what if we just use these logical, normal, philosophical, consistent worldviews that come from the Word of God? It's kind of what we're talking about, to decipher the information that we get. And quit falling for the propaganda to the point that we're allowing people to silence us. Pastors and churches and Christians are afraid to say this out loud. We find ourselves in hushed tones in restaurants going, you know what? It's getting bad. And when you do that, you're on the doorstep of state government control and communism or whatever that looks like. Do you feel that pressure? You used to call it being politically correct, but I think we're so used to it now we don't even acknowledge it.
Right.
Am I way over the pale? I've gone there, right?
No, do I feel the pressure? Not so much, because of the context that we're in. In this organization, we've decided we're going to stand for truth. We're going to stand for the Word of God, regardless. And so I don't feel pressure to to be silent.
But you're a hater, and you're being called a hater, and you're saying you're not empathetic, and you don't care about these people, and you know.
Well, then come have them, because most of them haven't sat down and had a conversation with me.
And they would say, well, you haven't sat down and had a conversation with them, and you don't understand their perspective.
Well, they don't know who I have and haven't sat down and had conversations with.
So or your intention for them.
Yeah, they don't understand that.
Yeah, you know, but I was watching something very recent. It was a little TikTok video, and a person was trying to say love is telling someone to consider not doing something that is detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is considered hate. I watched as people excoriated this person for gently saying, please consider that it may not be hate, it may be compassion that is compelling you to forsake a lifestyle that may be detrimental not only to you, but to your legacy. When did the voice become so singular that the very definition of love has been skewed?
And we found this to be more and more evident even in the psychological circles. You know, I mean, I know your wife is a counselor, and you do counseling yourself. Both of you do counseling. And when we withhold the truth, and when we begin to validate the behavior that people are coming in as a result of, you know, when we begin to validate that and say, well, it's okay, just press on, we're lying to them. And we're called to be, in those moments, truth tellers. We're called to be peacemakers in those situations. When we align ourselves with something that is not true, we are doing an absolute disservice, and we are completely not loving other people.
Absolutely.
So even as a counselor, somebody comes in, and your job in our culture is to affirm them and teach them how to deal with the guilt and the shame that are associated with the behavior, not to help them forsake that behavior.
Right.
And we're trying to make that criminal.
Mm-hmm.
Criminal. Deconversion.
Well, it has been made criminal. There are people in court now as a result of these very things.
Yeah, we're trying to make detransitioning or helping somebody detransition criminal. Where was the criminality for the first transition? Do you see? I mean, think about it. It doesn't even make logical sense. So you're saying that to help them detransition should be something that is illegal and horrible and immoral, but to transition in the first place is not, when you're just undoing something that was already.
So that brings us right back around to misinformation, disinformation, circle closed.
Gosh, circle closed. Incredible conversation, guys. Thank you, Clay. Thank you for your transparency and your boldness, Dan. Thank you for standing for righteousness, man. Final thought.
I think this whole conversation was a final thought.
Man, I wish this was something that we could promote and get out there. We're going to try it and see if they let it fly. So if you see this promoted and it's got more than 3 views, you'll see that it was successful. Clay, a closing thought?
The voice of dissent is vital. It was the voice of dissent that led to the ending of slavery. It was the voice of dissent that led to women having a right to vote. It was the voice of dissent many times it was the voice of dissent that led to the desegregation of our schools. You just go all throughout history. It's the voice of dissent that leads to the necessary and needed change. When you silence the voice of dissent, you're stifling your future.
Right. And let me say this: godly dissent
absolutely
is transformative. Nationally, internationally, culturally, on every level. Ungodly dissent has always been there. It is dangerous. And how do you recognize it? Very often you recognize it through the violence.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear somebody, holding or sharing a perspective and their actions don't correspond, as many Christians are that there are out there, they're not the ones who are attacking and destroying abortion clinics and those things. And you look at the pro-life centers that are being attacked and burned and desecrated, and the church's #1 attacked entity in America. Those Christians haven't been the perpetuators of violence and all of those things. You would think that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Mm-hmm. Where you see stealing, killing, and destroy, you can know the enemy is behind it. That's a Christian worldview. As a Christian perspective, Jesus said the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. We're asking you, please exercise wisdom, exercise discernment. We don't know. We have to dig through a world of minutiae when it comes to information. I want to encourage encourage you to do that wisely. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Please like this, subscribe to this, share this. Let's get the word out there, get the truth out there. And not only that, be a perpetuator of that. Fearlessly share the truth and the worldview of Jesus. Even if people hate, even if people hurt, you know what? We don't return evil for evil, but we overcome evil with good. God bless you. Thank you for being with us.